All right, so let's make a formal introduction for our listening. Good afternoon, Robert. Actually, good afternoon to me. Good afternoon. Good morning to you. It's still early on the
Oh, it's 3 p.m. here. Yeah.
Get you. And my name is Claudio. I'm calling you from Washington, D.C. From the studio in Fairfax City. We're very humble and grateful that Robert reached us with the invitation to our show. Robert, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
No problem. So whatever is that's going on in the world with the pandemic, some people want to take the vaccine, some people decided, no, we shouldn't take the vaccine, people die, and so on and so forth. How is this affecting, how you holding up your family, your music, the inability to do shows? Some people want to tour, some people don't like to tour. How this has affected your life in general?
Well, the strange thing is that although I'm quite happy not to tour, I'm very good at being a hermit. And my wife and I our day-to-day existence has not been hugely altered in the last 15 months. However, we've been very close to people who have gotten sick, and I've known one or two people who died of COVID, including Harold Budd, who was an acquaintance of mine, and a few other musicians as well. But the irony for me is that despite being a hermit who enjoys just being in the studio all the time, in the last few years, I was getting more and more larger concerts, and that was becoming an interesting development for me. Not always comfortable. The last concert I did was in November of 2019 in Hanoi, Vietnam, at a huge festival called Monsoon Festival, and I played for 15,000 people, and that's very strange for me because I'm used to playing for a couple hundred maximum, or maybe 50 or 100 is more common. But this was a festival with a wide range of music, from world beat to K-pop to a couple electronic artists, including myself. And it was very strange to feel, to try to do what I do, which is a very introverted kind of music, in front of an audience where the closest row is about 50 feet away from me, on a stage with a 50-foot high light screen behind me. It was very strange, but that sort of thing, I actually find myself out of my element, to be honest. The concert I did before that was in Poland for the 30th anniversary of Solidarity movement. It was like their 4th of July, basically, the 30th anniversary of their first election. And I played at the Solidarity Center, which is the same building where Lech Walesa has his office, and played a sleep concert all night long for about 150 people. And they said that it was the first time that the Solidarity Center had been kept open for the public overnight. And that was a great honor for me. And sleep concerts are something that I try not to do very often because as I'm getting older, it's really hard on my system. But one trick is to use jet lag for my favor. And so I'll travel 9 hours time zone shift, and then I can play all night long. And if I continue in my West Coast Pacific time zone in my sleep patterns, then I can actually pull it off without collapsing. But to be honest, not performing in the last year and a half has been just okay with me. And I've recorded 2 albums, and I've done an online concert for Steve Roach's festival, and that's available now on YouTube or free on my Bandcamp site called SoundQuest 2021. And I'm working on a new album, so I do mastering for other people. The studio is set up as much as a mastering studio is to record my own music, and I do a lot of mastering for a soundtrack label called Lakeshore. So did several albums for them in the last month or two, and staying very busy, actually.
That's pretty good. I mean, some other musicians, they have no choice, right? They don't release an albums at the same speed that you do, so they need to go on the road, right? Obviously, we're not talking about Coldplay or U2. We need to expand their reach, but the average kind of band or singer or musician that music is their living, and they are home, they cannot tour, they cannot so they're not bringing any income. Some people they'll do streaming, some people don't. So
the challenge right now also is that people aren't buying albums like they used to, and they are mostly getting their music from free online streaming sources, which pay very poorly for the musicians. And all of the technological influencers and pundits have been telling musicians for years that they should be making their money on concerts and not on their albums. And their albums are like a business card to give away to people. And that would never work for me or for many other independent artists that cannot draw huge crowds. And then, of course, after being told this for so many years and basically giving their music away on Spotify and elsewhere, making, more like 6/100ths of a penny per stream, then suddenly all the concerts go away. And so now both forms of their income have vanished, the recording income and the concert income. Yeah. And that's been a very strong punishment, I think, for a lot of artists. And again, concerts for me have been a way that I communicate closely and more intimately with my audience. And it's also a way to create a kind of ritual, to create a connection, a more energetic connection between the music and the audience and myself. And so it's not my main source of income. The thing is that my income trickles from so many different sources, many of which are not my recordings. But that includes sound design for synthesizer companies and mastering and many other small, projects that happen on an ongoing basis. So I feel very lucky in that sense that I'm not relying entirely on, gigging every 3 days at the local blues bar or something like that, which is what a lot of people are relying on.
Yeah. Yeah, we will talk about Bandcamp and Spotify, later on in the interview. But I know exactly what you mean. Many musicians now, like you, have studio at home, and they work with other artists, or they teach. If you're a guitarist or you're drummer, you're teaching. Take some studio to make a little bit of money to make that, right. It used to be that, I think, up to 20 years ago or so, musicians used to get paid, I think, $1 per CD or $2 per vinyl that is sold. Not anymore.
Yeah. I've been releasing albums since 1982, for the most part independently, but then I was on a record label for about 10 years, from 1989 to 1998 on Hearts of Space. And they were a very honest, very hardworking record label that helped me get my name out, and they relied a lot on the artists to be responsible for their own career also. But there were no advances, things. If there were an advance, it was very small, like $1,000 or something. And yes, you'd make about $1.20 or maybe $1 per CD sold. And that was, if they were going to sell 20 or 30,000 copies of something, that was decent. It still wasn't enough to make a comfortable living, but I used to joke that it was about the same salary as a postman or a garbage man might make. But you just don't have to deal with garbage all day long, and the only problem is you might not have a pension at the end.
That's right. Yeah. But my dad told me one day a long time ago, I grew up in a family with, I was born in South America. I was born in Chile, and I came to the United States to study after high school. And my dad told me a long time ago, when I was a kind of rebel, poor student, he told me, well, if you're good at what you do and you exceed at what you do, and then you pick something else, then you will do okay in life, And in your case, you're a very gifted musician, a very smart person, because I read your biography. You have done a lot of stuff. So
thank you. I benefited from that same positive message from my parents, and I'm very grateful. Yeah. They were worried about me because I was a little rebellious, and but even though I would get into trouble a lot, I was still a good student, and that gave them some confidence, I guess. Yeah. So I went to a good university and things, but really worried about me because I was hanging around with a bunch of crazy musicians, and making really strange experimental music. But my father was a jazz guitarist also, and he had always, I think, regretted that part of his life couldn't have pursued more of a professional music career. The best he ever got was doing a bit of soundtrack work with Vince Guaraldi on some Peanuts shows. which was pretty good, actually.
Pretty good, actually. Yeah, yeah.
But he actually was going to play with Vince Guaraldi on the day that Vince died in 1976, I think it was. He was going to play a small gig at a little bar in Menlo Park called the Red Cottage, and Vince Guaraldi had a monthly regular gig there, and had invited my father and his best friend, who used to play jazz together, to sit in with them. But then Vince Guaraldi ended up saying he didn't feel very good, and he went back to the hotel and he didn't wake up. So it was a little bit of a problem that day.
Yeah, man, I'm sorry to hear that. So in your case, when you were born in a musical family, how old were you when you began playing, I suppose, piano lessons or the keyboard or whatever?
Well, it's funny. I sang in choirs at my parents' church, and then took a little bit of viola lessons in public school. But I realized that I wasn't reading music. I for some reason, it just didn't connect with my brain. I have a brain that for some reason hears music but doesn't see it. I can't explain. So written music never made sense to me in that sight reading kind of way. But what I would do is when I was 10, 11 years old, I'd start just sitting at my parents' piano and starting playing and just improvising. And I loved Keith Jarrett, for example, and I loved, the things coming out of Germany at the time, Klaus Schulze and Tangerine Dream and Popol Vuh and things. This was probably 1970.
Do you know Popol Vuh as well?
Oh, huge influence, actually.
My God, man. We're like not many people know Popol Vuh, so I'm surprised.
I would say probably of that generation, my larger influences would be Popol Vuh and Klooster rather than Klaus Schulze or Tangerine Dream.
Yeah.
I was a huge Klooster fan, and I loved that. This was probably, I was 10, 11 years old, probably around 1973, 72, and was starting to get into music, and the time, was starting to buy records at the stores. And one thing that really changed me was around 1975 or so. I found this crazy 2-record set in the cutout bin at a drugstore, which mostly these bins were full of mainstream records of, Beach Boys and the Carpenters and things like that. And there was this strange record that was like $1.99, and it had a huge picture of a huge harp on the front, and this little hippie kid standing next to it with a flower in hand, and it said "Wind Harp Song from the Hill." And I thought, well, it's $2. I'm going to try this. And I remember putting this on and hearing something that was like the inside of my head. It was absolutely the way I heard sound, a cloud of everything singing at once, a sort of gong that just kept on sustaining with all these different shifts in sound, unpitched, untuned, just a huge cloud. And it was like magic to me. I would find myself just getting lost into this sound, and it was even more influential to me than the psychedelic music of the time, which was, Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin, or progressive rock like Yes and Genesis and things, which of course I was discovering at that time, as people do in 5th or 6th grade. And but I would put on this weird experimental stuff, and then discovered radio shows on a local listener sponsored station called KPFA, and they had a music director named Charles Amerkanian, who himself was a composer. He was a sound poet, and he also knew many of the avant-garde composers around the West Coast at the time, people who were moving into a kind of new tonal language, people like Terry Riley and Pauline Oliveros, and also in Mexico, Julian Carrillo, and I don't know, people like James Tenney, and so he would have this music director for this mostly news, left-wing news station would play avant-garde music in the mornings, and I would listen, especially during summer times when I wasn't in school. On weekdays I would listen to this wonderful avant-garde tonal language, and that started informing me as much as electronic music from Europe. I mean, this was also environmental sound artists like Anea Lockwood, and Pauline Oliveros was a big one, and I'm thinking, just a second, Bill Fontana, who would do sound installations with microphones and relocate sound and things. And so that's when I started going out and recording nature sounds with a cassette recorder and seeing if I could find ways of integrating those sounds into my electronic music, because I started building synthesizers around the late 70s, 76 or 7, I think, started. And
yeah.
So that to me was as much of an influence as the German space music scene. And this was this kind of deep listening music is what I like to call it, which was Pauline Oliveros's term. Much more useful to me as a terminology than ambient music or space music or new age or anything. People started calling it new age music in the 1980s, and that always bothered myself and bothered other friends of mine who were, this diffuse group of artists who slowly got to know each other around the West Coast that were trying to do this music. The thing is, none of us had a new age concept in our mind. We weren't interested at all in the mindset or the spirituality side of it. We just wanted to make intense music that was energetic and had a kind of shamanic power to it, a sort of magical power. But
you mentioned Popol Vuh. Of course, I know them very well. I'm trying to get a hold of one of the few members that are left and alive. Forgot the last name. Danny. I think it's Danny Fletcher. It could be. I need to look it up, but hopefully I can get a hold of him. And he lives in Germany, and would be a great to interview them. But yeah, I like their music, and I like different things. Believe it or not, I get the same satisfaction. Robert, Teresa, obviously Pink Floyd, Depeche Mode, and Peter Gabriel, Genesis, and Popol Vuh, and Tangerine Dream. I like different things in different dates, in different years, and it brings me satisfaction. I don't know what music that's for people.
Likewise, I have a very broad vocabulary. The things. When I was in high school, I was as much influenced by Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire.
That's Cabaret Voltaire, yeah, of course.
And Hawkwind and all sorts of stuff.
Hawkwind, yeah. It's just like one guy, one of the musicians told me, well, it is good music or bad music. It is,
just stuff that gives you energy, stuff that makes you feel excited. Yeah. And to this day, groups like Radiohead. There's a group that's only about 5 years old, I think, called Daughter. I'm very fond of them. An Icelandic.
No, I don't know them. Yeah.
Icelandic singer, and I think the musicians are mostly British.
Yeah.
Very moody, very dark, and sometimes the lyrics are so dark that they're funny. You want to just make sure she doesn't end up killing herself someday, because she sounds very, very touchy. But brilliant music. I really, really like that band. Elbow is a favorite band. I've seen them twice. Excellent British band. That's, to me, I don't know. I think Guy Garvey, the singer from Elbow, is sort of carrying on in the footsteps of Peter Gabriel in many sense, with extremely literate lyrics to his writing, and his voice is just beautiful. So there's a wide range of music that I love, and I still very much like the great jazz from the 60s, the free jazz, Sun Ra and Ornette Coleman, and
the beautiful thing, the negative thing for you as a musician, that you don't get money out of Spotify that much, almost nothing. But the beautiful thing for me, that I'm always discovering new bands. I pay whatever, a subscription, $10 a month or whatever that is. I'm always looking for new bands, looking for new people, new looking. I have a lot of it. I don't know. My music collection is about, 5,000 CDs, about 3,000 vinyl, and I keep on buying a lot. But I'm always looking for the other stuff, other band that weird names and weird band that I didn't.
Check out Daughter. I think you'll be impressed.
Yeah, I will.
Wonderful band, especially if you had interests in, I don't know. They sort of hover in that territory of Radiohead and, I don't know, Sigur Rós maybe.
I was trying to find one of the boxes of the Popol Vuh, but anyway, maybe it's upstairs.
Yeah. The problem with Popol Vuh is that they they had so many different repackaging of their different albums. They would mix and match so many albums that you had trouble finding out if you already had the songs on other things.
Yeah, they do like a box one, the best of, and box two, and the best selection of, whatever.
And they'd come out with a Werner Herzog soundtrack, and it would be just pieces from other albums also.
That's right, that's right. So you were, obviously, you are a very bright guy, and you were a very bright kid at 14, 15, and on one hand, you needed to make a decision on your own before approaching your parents and say, well, I have good grades, should pick college, go to a good school that you had, or they give the music a try and maybe we'll make some money, or
they gave up on me.
How you make it a decision, when you were 16, 17, and music was more than a hobby, right? For me, music is a hobby, but it's my life, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think to make a decision as well, right?
They were very gentle, and they would say things just like what your parents said to you, which is, we trust you. You seem good at what you do. And I pursued a degree in psychophysiology, and continue. I thought I was going to go into physics, but I wasn't good enough at math. It seemed the mathematics for the kinds of physics that interested me was beyond me. So I gave up on that, but found myself very attracted to research in states of consciousness. And at Stanford, they had a very good physiological psychology department and also the sleep center. And one of the people who had interested me a lot was Stephen LaBerge, who was working in the field of lucid dreaming. And he was the first person to actually find out ways of communicating to people while they were still in REM sleep back in the 1970s. He was doing these experiments with eye movements and training people how to get better at lucid dreaming, which is when you are aware that you're dreaming while you're dreaming, and you can become, you can manipulate the action in the dream.
Yeah,
but
we can do. I think we can do a part 2 on that, because I have another knowledge in that. So
yeah,
the time you went to Stanford, there was another center called SRI.
Actually, my father worked at SRI in the early 70s, in the late 60s. He designed a satellite that was doing low frequency sensing. Basically, I was fascinated in states of consciousness and understanding how the brain is a multi-processing thing that builds worlds constantly. And we actually, I was doing electronics for Stephen LaBerge and also for the Sleep Center, building them little measurement gadgets, and then started getting into medical electronics a little bit. And that helped me make enough money for my wife and me to buy our house in the late 70s. The late 80s, I mean to say. But every time I had a job for somebody, they always knew that I asked them, and I only worked for friends of mine. And I always said that if I have a concert to do, then I need to have leave without pay. I might need to go away for a week. And so I was already releasing albums when I was a freshman in college around 1982, my first album. And by the time I graduated, I had 4 albums out, and I was starting to travel a little bit to do concerts in Los Angeles and up the coast, Oregon and Seattle and Vancouver and things. So it was always the passion driving my life, and the job was something that I really wasn't all that good at because I didn't care much. And electronics for me was something I could do, and I could build synthesizers. I was doing that as a kid from kits mostly. I wasn't a designer. And so I had these skills. I could prototype electronics, and I could build simple medical devices and things. So that helped pay the rent for a while. And at a certain point, I was an adult, and my parents had nothing to say. I mean, I was doing it. I was already staying very active and living. And so at a certain point, they just wash their hands of you and they say, well, go for it. It's not their job anymore.
That's right. Yeah, you mentioned a question. We'll do a part 2 or part 3 of this interview where we can talk about remote viewing and out-of-body experience. And I know a lot about that area because I have researched it and I have had different experiences in my life. It's very, very interesting the way that consciousness work. And how the memories are stored in your brain, and it's very interesting stuff. And I'm happy that you like that kind of stuff, you know. So.
Well, those questions are still informing my music all the time. I mean, I tend to work in concepts most of the time, and many of my concepts are based upon ideas of consciousness and ideas of what is life. Even so, my album The Biode is based upon a sort of hypothetical possibility that every complex system might be alive at some sense or some level, and that simply we don't see it because our sense of scale is different. You know, for example, when they discovered 5 or 10 years ago that electrical and chemical impulses in the forest floor of an old growth forest would propagate electrically via the fungal mycorrhizal mat, that the fungus was actually communicating changes in the environment through a complex network of chemistry and even electricity. This brings up the question of whether fungus is like neurons for a forest, feeding and pruning and basically creating an energetic and information flow, chemical flow. However, if that's true, perhaps a forest is a mind or a consciousness that might live 10,000 years, you know, between ice ages or whatever. And the possibilities of that, to me, extend all the way into any complex system, or even, you know, if we're starting to explore outer space and we land on a planet and it looks like there's complexity, but just chemical complexity, how do we know there's not mind, even if we don't recognize things that are alive? You know, I think things like fungus, for example, are quite likely capable of creating complex systems. So often these speculations drive my music, and I will pursue these paths based upon mine. In fact, my most recent album is called Neurogenesis, one that I released a vinyl LP with as well, which is available out there. You can get it on Bandcamp, the actual vinyl. I ship them from my house here. But the idea of neurogenesis is a critique of the ideas that people of our generation grew up with when we were children. We learn in biology books that most of the neurons in the human brain were fixed by the time you were a teenager, and that it was just neuron death at that point onwards, and that all of the things you were going to learn were based upon the networks of interconnections with the ganglia between neurons. And there's a lot of truth to that. That's not wrong. However, what they've discovered in the last just 10 or 20 years is that there are stem cells in certain parts of the brain, including in the hippocampus and in the amygdala and olfactory bulb as well, where those stem cells are generating new neurons all the way up until our death. And to me, this gives a little bit of optimism about the ideas of constantly exploring new ideas, constantly learning new skills, even though they get harder as we get older. To me, there's a very optimistic idea in there, in this idea of neuroplasticity.
Absolutely. Are you aware of an institute that is 2 hours from here where I live in Virginia called the Monroe Institute?
I am.
Oh yeah, I got you. Yeah. Some very few people know that stuff. I have taken a couple courses and doing a little bit of the research on that, and it fascinated me. And I grew up in a Catholic family, right, in South America. So where the Catholic Church was telling me, okay, that's the way it is, right? And as I was after high school, I became a rebel, and I said, well, I don't think that's the way it is, right? And it isn't fixed. And you know, for example, a good example would be reincarnation. There's so much evidence about the people that research. People at the University of Virginia, the center, I think it's called the Center for Perceptual Studies. They have done a lot of research at that, and it's stuff that you cannot explain if you don't believe in reincarnation and so on and so forth. It's very so as if, and the way the conscious said, and then what happened after we cross over. I wouldn't use the word die because I would think we never died to begin with, but the way that we cross over and who we really are it's not a physical body, right? It's very, very interesting stuff, man. So we can.
Yeah, it's and who knows? I mean, I think that there's a lot of different approaches. I tend to be of a school that I suppose would be philosophically lumped into the materialist school, but it's more informational, which is more of a cybernetic materialism, which is to say that I think that a lot of ideas of structure and of what we could call life or consciousness are informational phenomenon rather than purely biological phenomenon. And I'm inclined to be materialistic, though, beyond that, and say that I don't think I need an understanding. I don't think I need to believe in a soul or believe in any sort of afterlife to have some sense of understanding that there are levels of communication and levels of structure that are far beyond our ability to understand. So I'm very open-minded. When we were doing laboratory work back at Stanford in the mid-1980s, Monroe Institute contacted us because they were interested in our sleep research. And they sent us some of their hemisync tapes. And because I was a recording artist and had a studio, I was able to analyze them and to see what they were doing. And it was a very, very simple pitch shift. However, the main thing that we found is that a correlation with frequencies of EEG waves are not a causation to any state of consciousness. You can drive frequencies in the electroencephalogram, and it doesn't actually mean that people are experiencing different thoughts or different states of consciousness. However, the meditative state that they might go into simply by closing their eyes and being in a calm state of meditation is going to affect them every bit or more so than any of the sensory stimuli they might be experiencing.
Wow, yeah, very, very interesting stuff. Okay, I'm quite sure we can talk hours and hours about that, and I have a lot of questions to ask you. So you have, man, in your life, you have 4 decades, over 50 albums in ambient music, dark-ambient, tribal, trance, and over your life, you went into different areas. How in the world you managed to be so prolific in music? What drives you? Like, why, Robert, wake up in the morning or during the weekend and go to bed? And I said, man, I have the idea and I want to work something else. In 2 months, I have another idea. I want to collaborate with Steve Roach and so on. Work. What's the motivation inside yourself to keep on producing more stuff? Is you have no control? I mean,
it's sometimes it's just a drive. The music plays me, I guess. What happens is that I'm a very curious person. I explore my mind and I explore ideas. I read a lot and I also introspect a lot. I go inside. I like to call it spelunking, like cave exploring, And I think a lot of people are less inclined to just go into the dark recesses of their imagination and pull up strange things. But what happens for me is that I've developed habits, perhaps you'd say, of building realities in my imagination. And it's a form of imitative magic, basically. Are you familiar with the story by Jorge Luis Borges, The Circular Ruins?
Yeah. He's from Argentina. Yeah, I know exactly who he is. Yeah.
Yes, so there's a short story called The Circular Ruins about a magician who dreams his next generation, right? He dreams a person. He goes near a village which is sort of afraid of him, and he goes and sleeps in the forest and sleeps for a year, basically. And people in the forest know that he's a shaman, and they come and bring food as a form of tribute. And he wakes up and he eats and he goes back to sleep. And slowly he builds his son. He builds his child in his mind until a huge conflagration happens. The forest catches on fire, and out the corner of his eyes, he witnesses a person running away. And Borges was wonderful, of course, at creating this sense of magic. But what that story is about is the creative process in a metaphor. And this is a process of imitative magic, where you basically build the art in a complete facsimile. in your imagination, one hair at a time, one skin cell at a time. If it's a city, it's one road and one telephone and one doorway and one window and one, sidewalk at a time, until it takes on a life of its own, and you open your eyes and there it is, and suddenly you have created something that did not exist, and now it exists. Another great writer who has some of these ideas is Italo Calvino, an Italian writer. If you look at his book, Invisible Cities, it's another metaphor for this idea of the infinitude of the creative process, how you can go into the world of imagination and find infinity. And so I have made a life's effort to practice this craft or skill of imagining. And it's not by asking myself, what do I want to say? It's not by asking myself, what can I do, or what do I want to do, or how am I going to perceive, how do people want to perceive me, or anything like that. It has nothing to do with social perceptions, except once I'm done and then trying to figure out how to get rid of it. What it has to do with is entirely asking what wants to exist. And it says, I want to exist. And then I explore what it is. Where's that voice? What is that voice? And it says, well, I'm a bit like this. I have this mood. I have this color. I have this landscape. Come into me. Come walk into my landscape. And I go there, and it might take me months. It might take me 2 or 3 months of feeling like I have no idea left, like I'm empty without skills. And my wife is very patient with me. She knows that I'll come up with something, but I'll just go for a lot of long walks. I'll read a lot of books. I'll cook. I'll drink a little too much. Just basically live life. And slowly this world starts forming. And it says, here I am, time to make me. And then I have to figure out what it is and how to make it. It's like a sandcastle, and it's going to wash away. So you just, you go down to the beach and you start making it. And that's what happens every year, and maybe a little more often than a year, but it's more or less once a year, maybe 2 a year, 3 in 2 years. I don't know. As I get older, it slows down, but maybe it's just this time, 1 or 2 of those projects happen to be 8 or 9, 7 or 8 hours long. So there's a lot of music out there.
Have you ever had an out-of-body experience? I mean, have you practiced lucid dream, and have you used a
yes, but I would say that
semi-sync tape to go into different stages, like John Monroe described?
My out-of-body experiences are not fully hallucinatory like that, but they are sensory. When I'm in a lucid dream, I'm aware that it's a dream. I think an out-of-body experience is often actually a misinterpreted imaginary experience. But I've had many imaginary travels. In fact, one of these skills came early when I was a teenager. Yeah. My parents moved to my grandparents' house. My grandparents had passed away in the early 70s, and we lived in their house, which had a creek running near it. And I had the best room in the house. It was like a little treehouse room in the corner. And there was this huge oak on the second floor, by the way. And there was this huge oak tree that wrapped around the windows, these bay windows that were on both sides. And I put my bed right out into the corner of these windows. And on a rainy winter's night or spring morning, or, early morning hours, midnight, 2 in the morning, I would just have the windows open and listen to the rain and the creek and the frogs at night, and travel outside with my ears. And I realized that hearing was a very special sensory input, because you didn't need to see it. You could be there in your mind, and you could travel through space in the dark. You could hear around walls, right? And we're such a visual animal that we forget that we can relocate ourselves even through imagination. And I would find myself floating out through the tree branches and over the creek and listening to the frogs teaching me polyrhythms, because these Western tree frogs have this certain way of spacing their chirp so that they don't land on each other. And they use their chirp in order to identify their location in order for mating. And what this creates is a very special kind of polyrhythm where everything is in its own space and time. And I still hear rhythm in the same way, where I don't hear rhythm as a big pounding chunkin, 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 chunka like dance music. And I have trouble with rhythms like that. In fact, they bother me. Instead, I hear them like the frogs. And I remember those, what you would call out-of-body experiences, but for me were sensory journeys, where you're hearing these ba-dup, 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 ba-dup. And I started studying how random rhythms could occur with mechanical things like if you have a button in an electrical dryer or a coin. Let's say you have some pants in your dryer and a coin has fallen out and you hear this tinka tinka tink tinka tink tinka tinka tink and it's random but it's synchronized, and it's a fantastic sort of study in syncopation. And that's one reason I think I just always loved really good jazz drummers, because they could play that sort of open sounding rhythm. So when I work with rhythm in my music, which is not all the time, but sometimes, I love these rhythms that are more open and suggestive and not driving. They're the rhythms of nature and the rhythms of fractals and of roots and wind and rivers, you know.
Wow, beautiful, man. Before I forget, I wrote myself a note for you. If you like Jorge Luis Borges, try to, maybe you have read that. It's another famous writer from Colombia who wrote a famous book called 100 Years of Solitude.
Of course, I've read almost everything that Marquez has written.
Marquez, yeah, of course, if you like that. It's
Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Yeah, it's mystical. Obviously, he won the Nobel Prize. Obviously.
Oh, yes, well, Cien Años de Soledad is an amazing, just the way that, even though it's a 600-page book, how it folds up into itself into a huge magical story. And again, it is that metaphor of creation in and of itself. It is a story about writing, isn't it? It's a story about imagination.
Yeah.
And I absolutely love Marquez.
Yeah, and if you like poetry, of course, from my own country, Pablo Neruda.
Of course, Neruda is one of the great spiritual poets of all time.
Oh, my God, man, he's amazing, man. So feel free to elaborate on your all-night sleep concert. I think the first you performed in 1992, and it became sort of legendary in the San Francisco area, right, at the time. And feel free to elaborate and whatever you want to, which direction you want to take it.
Sure. Well, I was trying to figure out ways of bringing this slow way of listening to people. I mentioned the way I was just taking my ears outside of the windows in the rain, and I had been starting to record nature sounds. And also with my home-built electronics, I would just let them run with these patches that would sound like insects or whales and underwater things. I was trying to create patches that would randomize sort of and create always changing sounds. Not that it really worked that way, but what I would find myself doing is having sound going all the time, just these kinds of environments that I wanted to create, and trying to live inside of us, a sort of sonic cocoon, a chamber that was very comforting to me. Probably I had some psychological need for this. Perhaps I was borderline autism or something. I don't know exactly. But I found this to be so magical and so powerful that I was trying to think of ways to frame it. And at the time, I had never had any art school experience. I still haven't. I don't know anything about what they teach in art school. But one thing that I thought they should teach is ways of defining your ideas that you could communicate them succinctly and powerfully. And so a lot of the time I was spending trying to find ways of framing my interests, or ways of explaining my interests, creating a sort of mission statement, as it were. And slowly, over a year or two, when I was maybe 16, 17 years old, I started realizing that the music I wanted to make was very slow and very empty. And it wasn't about ego. I wanted this music to disappear and to point to everything other than itself. I think I might have been influenced a lot by Zen Buddhism. And there's a wonderful poem by Basho, which essentially translates as, "I point at the moon, why do you look at my finger?" And there's also a similar phrase by Rumi. It says, "Don't look at my hand, take what is in it." And I really liked this idea that the music would not be about ego, it wouldn't be about myself, but rather about the listener. And that it would point back at the listener and try to vanish itself, try to be about something other than ego, but rather to be about environment and to be about a heightened state of time and a heightened state of place or consciousness. So then I was reading a lot of sociology, I guess ethnomusicology would be the word, things about trance ritual in Indonesia, in Bali, and there's a wonderful book about African music called The Soul of Mbera, which is about how shamanism and storytelling goes on in sub-Saharan, in mostly Ghana, or Mali, I guess. In any case, these ideas of traditional societies that were using music as a form of energetic communication, not as a form of ego enhancement. That combined with this interest in environmental art and these artists that were influencing me a lot, like Anea Lockwood, who had planted pianos in England for them to grow, trees to grow through the pianos and for them to slowly dissolve, or Bill Fontana, who created relocated environments, like he put up microphones along the Great Barrier Reef to record waves propagating down the beach over a kilometer or two, and then set those multi-track recordings down hallways in a museum so that people could stand there and actually hear the propagation of the wave across a great distance of ocean. Things like that fascinated me, and I wanted to try to find ways to get people to sit still for a very long period of time in order to be able to explore themselves and explore their mind. And the only way I could think of doing that was to encourage them to fall asleep. And it was a trick, really, because it's not about sleep music. It's not about music to help you sleep. And that was a common misunderstanding as these things, continued, because in fact, they were about almost the opposite. They were about creating an energetic space, a ritual space where people are doing something that they don't normally do, which is to sleep with strangers in a public space. The music then was designed as a kind of thread, or a consciousness thread, to create an excuse to do this unusual ritual, but also so that if you come in and out of sleep in a very light state of consciousness, you're relocated back to where you are and you have a sense of continuity. I used to think of it like a cave explorer might weave a little, might lead a string out behind them so they could find their way back through the cave in the dark. So if they make a wrong turn, they always can follow the string back. And I thought of the music a little bit like that thread in a spelunker's kit, to keep yourself from getting lost, as it were. Or as people are going in and out of a very light stage of sleep, I was thinking of this metaphor of being like a stone skipping across the water, where you're dipping in and out of a light state of alternate consciousness, a light state of dreaming. So in fact, really, these sleep concerts speak more to the state of consciousness, which would be called hypnagogic or hypnopompic dreams, or states of sleep, stage 1 sleep, where your dreams are often very random and very strange, and sometimes just little images fit with words, and you don't really remember what happened because when you're asleep, your short-term memory gets shut off. So by having this energized sleeping space, people would come in and out of sleep and have more awareness of their altered states of consciousness, and they could find ways of exploring them. And that's what it was about, really. It wasn't about relaxation. It wasn't about helping people sleep at all. It's actually about energy.
Oh man, it's beautiful, man. Very good explanation. Have you ever thought about teaching a class, like a local?
I've taught. I taught a class in audio mastering for 9 years at a local college, and I've given lectures for the Leonardo Society and things like that. I am open to it. Also, whenever I do a sleep concert, I usually give about a 10-minute talk in advance of to the audience, and I say more or less what I just said, and essentially give them a sort of quick handbook to how to use this music, how to use this experience.
So how often do you do that? The kind of how we want to call it, the all-night sleep concert?
Sleep concerts. It was.
You do that? I mean, have you done in the last, 5 years, 10 years?
Oh yeah, the last one I did was in Poland, as I said, in 2019. I was doing about one a year, often around the world. So I did one in Japan, I did one in Copenhagen, in Warsaw. I'm sorry, in Gdansk, in Gdansk, and also in Krakow. But in any case, about once a year, I guess. I was doing them around the Bay Area when I was in college, including for like a conference at Asilomar in Monterey for the Association of Sleep and Dreaming. So it was a bunch of psychologists coming to see what this thing was about. And that was around 1985. So I was actually I might have still been a senior in college, or it was right after I graduated, but I was still working on research at the time. And, and then I would do them at a very unusual place that was in Berkeley, California, called Shared Visions, that was run by a radio host who would interview a lot of new thinkers, people who were, people like Timothy Leary, or, people like that, sort of experimental thinkers. And that's actually the first one I did was in my dormitory at Stanford University when I was 18, when I was a freshman, and then branched out to other areas, but only about one a year. And then in the mid 1980s, I actually came down with mononucleosis, and it wiped me out. I got really sick for 6 months, and I couldn't stay up all night anymore, which was I was trying to do a thesis experiment in sleep research, and it really wrecked me. So I couldn't really pull an all-nighter, and I stopped doing them for 10 years. And then a radio station in Irvine, California in 1995 was playing my music on their ambient electronic music shows. And the music director for KUCI, this radio station, and asking if I was willing to do these again. And I said, I don't think I can. I don't really think I'm up for it. And he was persistent, and he said, well, what about if you did it on the radio? And we invited a really small audience to the radio station, just people we know and trust, and they could sleep in the lobby, and you could set up in the extra room in the control room. And I thought, oh, that sounds, that could work.
Yeah, they convinced you.
And so they got me back to doing sleep concerts in 1995, and it was enough of a success, and it got a little bit of a buzz, that the next year I decided to do a tour around the country of free sleep concerts on radio stations. And I drove myself around the country and played about 20 or 30 concerts for 3 months. And it was crazy. And, played on radio stations, and there's recordings of those concerts around. But then after that, I took a break again from it, because these things just kill me. They wipe me out. I get sick usually after this. But what I decided then is, because I really didn't want to play them live anymore, I would put them on a DVD. And DVDs in the late 1990s were just brand new. They were just coming out. And I thought, wow, there's 3.5 gigabytes of data on here. I can fit 7.5 hours or 8 hours of music on there. And so I worked for 2 or 3 years on the album Somnium from around 1998 to 2000, 2001. It finally came out. And collected recordings, did field recordings all around California, in the mountains and down at the coast. And anywhere I was traveling, in fact, when I was out doing these sleep concerts in 1996, I always had a recorder with me. So, you know, got cicadas in Iowa in the middle of the summer and all of this kind of thing. And was right at the bleeding edge of what the technology can do to create a continuous piece of music for 7 hours. But then in the end, it turned out I was pushing also the technology of the DVD, because they had trouble authoring this. They couldn't create a continuous piece. And in fact, Somnium had a unfortunate technical glitch where the compression, that the company that was authoring it for me made a mistake with their compression algorithm, and the middle chapter, the middle 2 hours of Somnium comes out in mono. And I didn't even catch it until somebody, a listener, caught it and told me, and I was like, oh, damn, I hate it when that happens, you know. And but at the time there was no streaming or anything. Since then, really, it's turned out that something like Bandcamp is a perfect format for people to download and listen to these things. Really, it comes out much better off of a computer hard disk, because then there's no limitations as far as duration, and you can have a continuous 8-hour piece of music. You still have to break it up into chunks. And so I've done 3 recordings now of these all-night pieces: Somnium, Perpetual, and then a live concert, a live sleep concert, which is called Sleep Concert at the Gray Area, which was a festival that I performed, the San Francisco avant-garde music festival called Noise Pop, and they invited me to play a sleep concert there.
Gotcha. So, question about the Bandcamp versus Spotify, right? And on Bandcamp, right, for people that they like download and digital stuff versus streaming, right? So, by the way, for me, I like to collect things. I mean, I need the real thing. I download it where I can listen 10 seconds and then go to the next song and get to the next song. It doesn't do it for me, right?
I still print CDs, even though my attic is full of thousands of CDs from extra pressings of old albums. Yeah. And as I said, I even printed out a vinyl LP from the most recent album. Yeah. It's quixotic. It really is rather old-fashioned and silly at this point. Our generation is like that. I feel much better when I can hold something in my hands, the result of my work. As an artist, I started painting again. I started doing visual art because I was getting so sad about the immateriality of modern music distribution, because I get so much pleasure out of making a CD, a compact disc with all the artwork, the package, holding it in my hand, and even the process of shipping it to customers, to people who buy it. But one thing lovely about Bandcamp is that they allow artists to communicate directly with directly with their audience, and they allow you to sell merchandise, CDs, T-shirts, records, anything.
And you get paid, I think they only take like 10%, you get paid 90% or so, right?
Exactly.
So it's good. That's the way it should be, right?
And artists can communicate directly with their audience. They run their own business. They run their own web page. They ship their own items if they want to. That's the way I've always worked. You know, I had a record label for 10 years, but I was on a record label for 10 years, but I still was my own manager, my own agent, my own lawyer, and drove myself around the country. I was my own roadie and, you know, my own booking agent. That was the way I prefer. And so Bandcamp to me is a perfect evolution of that for independent artists who really prefer not to follow anybody else's rules and not to do what a record label expects of them. I can just communicate directly to my audience and sell CDs and records, vinyl and things directly to them. And they can also download the music and listen to it on their computer immediately after buying it while they're waiting. You know, if they have to wait a week for the CD to come, they're still enjoying the music. And not only that, but I can actually make music available at the highest possible resolution. So I can sell downloads to them at 24 bits, 96 kilohertz. The only thing they don't do is surround. So I actually love doing surround mixes. And there's another website based out of Denmark called Surround Music 1. So the words surround music and then .1 like it's a .com.
Yeah.
So Surround Music One is selling surround mixes for a lot of different artists directly, and they are wonderful. It's one person, a wonderful, honest person, and